So thank you very much. A great pleasure to be here, and thanks to the Embassy for inviting me and for the conference for having me on this panel. In terms of myself, with CETA, I go way back. The original joint study between Canada and the EU involved my own department, and I was the lead economist for the Government of Canada on that file. And I've seen the progress of this agreement go now about a decade later. It's coming to fruition, so it's wonderful to actually see this happen. And I'll say a little bit about the importance of the agreement, but just about a context. History has its delicious ironies. If we go back to the first attempt by Canada and the EU or the European community to strike a free trade agreement, it was back in the early 1970s. In 1971, President Nixon, a Republican president, imposed tax measures, a tariff surcharge on Canada and everyone else. These were the Nixon measures, and this was Canada's first option for trade. And then in 1972, the United Kingdom joined the European community, and Canada lost its imperial preferences, and this was option 2 for Canada. So we went for the third option. If you've ever wondered why it was called the third option, it was because options 1 and 2 just kicked Canada in the shin on trade, and we went looking. We got a deal with the European community, but it was not a very strong one. And it was also ironic that it was under, of course, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the father of the current Canadian Prime Minister. So we fast forward 4 decades, and we have what? We have a Republican president threatening to impose tariff measures, and we have the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, and Canada gets a trade deal with the European community under a Trudeau government. So I think there's these ironies are, as I said, just delicious. I think God has been writing scripts and looked at this and said, we'll go with this one. This is just too good to pass up. So that's how we got here. But CETA as a statement for the international community, I think is very important at this time. It affirms a commitment to rules-based trade towards open economies, and it also affirms the commitment to multilateralism. And this is a striking contrast to what we're hearing from the Trump administration, which has announced a commitment to reciprocal trade negotiations, one-on-one, where the United States has got typically a stronger hand against every negotiating partner. And also where CETA increases binding commitments. This again contrasts, and therefore by binding it increases certainty of market access for parties in Canada and in the European Union. Again, this contrasts with the indications from the Trump administration that the United States may not be bound by its past commitments. The USTR 2017 trade policy emphasized that the Congress ultimately rules, and there were several statements that the WTO rules might not be observed. Peter Navarro, the White House head director of the Trade Policy Council, indicated as well that there's one cannot rely on past bindings. And at the G20, the U.S. position did not reaffirm multilateralism. So there's a lot of uncertainty coming out of the United States on where the world will go on trade policy. And CETA is a striking reaffirmation of the multilateral open rules-based system. So it's incredibly important at this time. I would say much more important for that reason than for the economics. But I'm not here to talk primarily about the politics of it. I do want to talk about the macroeconomics a little bit. Now, we haven't had a formal study yet put out in play by either Canada or by the European Commission on what the impact of the CETA will be on the economy. Now, I just want to mention about how these particular studies are done. The conventional method of measuring the impact of a trade agreement is to use a computable general equilibrium model. And this creates sort of a fiction. It says, here's a hypothetical, or the economy as it was at one point in time, and we imagine going back to sometime in the distant past and putting in place the CETA, and then saying, how would this economy look with and without the CETA? And we measure it in those terms, kind of a point-to-point comparison. And we also make all kinds of assumptions about full employment of resources. So this is not a set in context of the real economy. It's not a forecast about the way the world will turn out under CETA. It says, is the European and Canadian economies, are they more efficient with the deal in place or less efficient? Are we wealthier with it or not wealthier without it? And typically what we find when we remove border measures, when we remove tariffs, we get better welfare, better economic outcomes. Now, it's kind of hard to actually visualize this when we're dealing with very large economies like Canada and the European Union, but it's actually very easy to understand if you think of an economy like Iceland. Okay, Iceland has got 330,000 people, and it would, without trade, it would live off fish and seasonal vegetables. It would have a very, very poor lifestyle. With trade, it has a per capita GDP of an advanced country and enjoys all of the products of all the world. So the reason why you get benefits from trade when you understand Iceland's situation is you get the benefits from imports. You get to shop in the global mall and you get everything that the world provides, from computers coming out of Japan and game machines coming out of Japan to vacations in the south when it's freezing up north. So that's why we trade. But you might wonder then why governments emphasize exports. Well, as you know, it's very easy to go shopping in the mall if you've got a job and an income. Well, exports are a country's job in the world. That's how we earn the money to go shopping in the global mall. So governments focus on the tough part of the equation, which is earning the money, earning that foreign exchange. So that's why we emphasize exports. We're not being mercantilist, we're just being sensible. But for that reason, if you understand how trade makes you wealthier and gives you better options, when you run this through an economic model, the economic model gives you this back. It tells you, it puts numbers around it. So that's kind of where we come out of it. So if we think about CETA in this general equilibrium context where we've got full employment, it will have a fairly small impact on the economies of the European Union and on Canada for a very good reason, because we're already very open economies and there is not a lot of additional room to rejuggle what we're doing to make ourselves more efficient. At the same time, it is a positive deal. And I'll try and put some numbers around this. The joint study in 2008, sorry.
Yes, just, you could not see this.
That's sorry. I was forgetting myself. But this is the part I brought the PowerPoint for, was to put some numbers here for you. So the joint study in 2008 was a rather optimistic study. It talked about the potential if you went as far with liberalization as you possibly could, including moving Canada, Europe services trade to the level of openness within the European Union. So it was very ambitious. And it came up with figures that would be less than a tenth of a point of GDP for the European Union, but about a point, almost a percentage point of gain for Canada. 0.77 was the actual figure from that study. And it had a fairly significant increase in bilateral trade on the order of 20% or so, two-way trade expanding. And those are pretty reasonable kinds of figures for this relationship. A more realistic study of the potential gains from the trade deal as actually mandated to the negotiators and as was being negotiated is the European Commission's Trade Sustainability Impact Assessment, and that came out with about 0.02 impact on the European economy. Now, to put that in context, that's going to be something like the growth of the European Union will get in a quarter. So it's not going to transform the world. He will not shake the world. It's be a nice, tidy little deal. For Canada, it was about, the figures came out about 0.2 to 0.3 or 0.4 on that order of magnitude. Now, my own company has done a study for the province of Nova Scotia, which is not published, And here I can say that we came up with figures which are very similar to the Trade Sustainability Impact Assessment, basically on the order of 0.02 welfare gains for the EU and 0.2, so 10 times larger for Canada. So what we have, and also I got Jeff Bergstrand, who does gravity modeling, to run the CETA through his nice new gravity model, and he came up with basically the same kind of figures. So I think we can triangulate and say this is roughly the order of magnitude of the impact of the CETA. We await what DG Trade will publish on that deal, but I think if CETA is properly modeled, and we can talk about modeling protocols, it will come out there. So it's a nice deal. It's balanced in terms of the amount of two-way trade that will happen. And for Portugal and for Canada, it's going to, for those companies that actually are engaged in trade right now and are doing business in areas where there are tariffs, it's going to be a great deal. They will find a significant new sort of reduction of tariffs and barriers, and they will make market gains. Now, the other thing to sort of think about in terms of, if you think about the deal in this general equilibrium framework, right, just the pure efficiency gains, which you see up on the screen, they are likely to understate what you will get in a real life situation right now. CETA is happening at a time when both economies have got a lot of slack. There's a lot of unemployment in both countries. And there's also a lot of new uncertainties emerging from a mutual trading partner in the United States. So companies are going to be looking for new opportunities, and CETA opens the door for that. So, and this is, the gains here are going to be different than the ones which are typically described in this economic framework of general equilibrium, where basically the usual story is comparative advantage, and this is easily understood in the following sense. If you have a dentist and a secretary, and the dentist is actually a better secretary than the secretary, it still is to the advantage of both of them for the secretary to focus on secretarial duties and the dentist to focus on dentistry duties, because they're mutually more efficient, okay? That's the kind of comparative advantage gains. So Canada and Europe would specialize in their areas of relative advantage, and that gives you those kinds of gains. But that's a weak force for growth, actually. Where you get the really strong gains are from the entry of new firms into international trade. Now, in the current context of a lot of macroeconomic slack and companies looking for business, having the CETA opening the door will be important. So firms that are currently not trading will enter into trade. And this drives a lot of interesting developments. Companies that enter into trade start to invest in human capital development, they invest in physical capital, they raise the level of their game. What also happens is that as imports come in, some of the weakest companies go out of business. So your strongest companies expand, your weakest go out, your average productivity rises. The gains from trade in that sense are much stronger than the ones that we actually describe. So we have to try and build those into our studies, and it's quite difficult to calibrate. But I anticipate that the CETA coming into play at a time when the world is uncertain, when people are looking for new opportunities, it will outperform what we're showing here in our studies. How much time do I have here?
You have to turn to the slide there.
Yeah. Sorry, here we go, right, yes. Sorry.
Yeah. 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. Oh, sorry. No. Here we go. Here. Yeah, so I'd like to talk a little bit about the CETA features and sort of what we can say about quantifying them. The first thing is on tariff elimination is easily quantified, but one thing that we do not quantify very well is the impact of tariff binding. Now, Canada unilaterally lowered tariffs on all kinds of industrial inputs back in budget 2010, but these were not bound. So CETA binds that. Canada had always had the ability to go back to its WTO level of bindings on those tariffs, but now it can't against Europe. Now, is this a real concern? Well, recently Canada graduated a bunch of countries that we were providing the general preferential tariff to and went back to the MFN tariff. So we raised tariffs on a whole range of countries because we could. But the binding under CETA prevents that. Europe also suspends all kinds of tariffs. So the European tariff on Canadian blueberries is suspended. So when we model CETA, we don't actually see the numbers changing, so there's no benefit. But Europe could always remove that, could have raised the tariff back to what it is, 12 or 14%. And now they can't with CETA. So this provides a new degree of certainty for market access for traders on both sides of the Atlantic, and this is valuable. We quantify the value of reducing uncertainty is roughly half the value of actual bindings. Our quantitative assessments do not incorporate this, so we understate this, and it is important for both Canada and for Europe. Even though we are both rules-based countries, we still have got some flexibility to raise tariffs, and we sometimes do. So CETA prevents that. In terms of the horizontal goods facilitation, a lot is said that CETA addresses non-tariff barriers. Here the story is not quite as significant as might be thought. On the horizontal measures, both Canada and the European Union have entered into signed on to the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, and this sets a new high bar for the standards to be met at the border, and the CETA does not improve upon that for either Canada or for the European Union. So there's no additional benefits. I mean, where it's confirming a high quality standard of border treatment for traders, but it does not improve upon what we've already committed to under the WTO. So we cannot give CETA credit for stuff that we already gave credit to under the WTO. On sector-specific measures, and I think the ambassador was talking about the certification bodies, to try and understand the quantitative significance of this, if a company is actually applying to have its product certified, it will be a significant chunk of money to actually have it certified for access to the Canadian market. But what CETA does is it gives mutual recognition of these conformity assessment bodies, or CABs. And then if you take a look at the revenue, annual revenue of these bodies, it works out to, as a percentage of the turnover on the market, it's about 0.2, 0.3%. So the annual cost to companies of conformity assessment for domestic markets as well as for international markets amounts to about 0.2 or 0.3%. Now, what mutual recognition does is say that a Portuguese company that wants to have its product certified for Canadian standards can use its European CAB, which already has the data on its product, already has assessed the product for conformity with European standards, and says, you know, it also meets Canadian standards. So Canadian standards still apply. It still has got to get certification to put its product on the Canadian market, but it has the advantage of doing it through its local CAB, which it knows and which knows its product. So there will be a saving of money and time and hassle factor. But when you think about at the economy-wide level, the overall payments to these conformity assessment bodies is on the order of about 0.2, 0.3%. So it won't have the huge macroeconomic impact. It will have a nice impact for companies as they're doing business. The sector-specific NTBs, there were some gains there, but they were quite modest. We still don't have the situation where if you're a car company and you roll off a production line, car off the production line in, say, in Germany, you can sell it in Canada. It doesn't happen. You still got to make modifications and so forth. So we're not at that point where you've got the non-tariff barriers have truly sort of been eliminated. And CETA whittles away at that, but it's fairly minor on that score. On services, the main cross-border measures, I think, are in movement of persons, which is important for companies that invest abroad and that sell abroad to provide aftermarket service. That's, however, one of the weaknesses of our modeling environment is that we don't measure this movement of persons thing. There's no quantification of that. So again, we understate the impact of the CETA in our quantitative models with that because we don't capture that. But in terms of the measure on direct cross-border trade, CETA does not really liberalize cross-border trade on an applied basis. What it does do is, again, it binds both Canada and the European Union have got a better regime on an applied basis than is bound under the WTO. So we could always have reverted back to our WTO bindings. Here's a dirty little secret from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which very few people know. There was a clause that said, no matter what we said in this agreement, we reserve the right to go back to our bindings under the WTO. And there was no binding effect for 6 of the major TPP parties. CETA does not have that escape clause, that get out of jail free card. CETA binds. And that, again, is an important feature. This is where the CETA actually has some impact on company decision-making. It says that the market access that you have now will be there in the future. So that's very good. On FDI, we already have got very open regimes, and we could not identify a significant impact on foreign direct investment. That, too, is consistent with the general finding in the economic literature, which says that bilateral investment treaties have no impact on FDI. So I anticipate when we do ex-post analysis of the CETA that we will not see that there will be a surge of bilateral foreign direct investment as a result. The key question on FDI, of course, has been the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, and we can talk about that. That will be talked about, but that's not, of course, enforced on a provisional basis. On government procurement, the CETA is very liberal and liberalizes significantly for European companies in Canada. Now, the story here is really the fact that even within the European Union, where there's complete free and open procurement on a cross-border basis, the 94% of all procurement, at least, is done through local establishments. So when German companies come to do government procurement in Portugal, they don't do it from Germany. They have a subsidiary in Portugal to do it. And that's because a lot of government procurement is simply of that nature. The nature of the business means you have to be locally around. Construction, for example, maintenance of buildings, most services. So the share of government procurement that is actually traded across borders directly is really quite small. CETA will improve that, and it will be a nice chunk of business for companies that will be able to do it, but it will not be game-changing for the economy on that ground. Now, there are 2 areas. So, it's a nice, tidy deal and will not be disruptive particularly. I think it will be very good in terms of getting more companies into trade, and that will have a bigger benefit for the economy than we can put numbers on. And as I said, the reduction of uncertainty, I think, is really important. There are 2 areas where I think the CETA could be substantially improved. And the first one is in terms of getting small companies into trade. Now, the de minimis rule for a product having to have the rules of origin documentation. Rules of origin documentation says, does a product qualify for these tariff preferences, or does it have to pay the MFN tariff? And typically, these products must have sufficient content in them that's either generated within the European Union or Canada in order to meet the threshold to qualify for these preferences. You have to have documentation to prove that. That means documenting your supply chain, obtaining various documents. There are fixed costs to this, and if you're an occasional trader, then for you to go to the bother of acquiring all this documentation, putting in place the tracking, and then keeping these records for 5 or 7 years, whatever, and being at risk of being audited and then having to pay the tariff if the customs authority decides that no, your product did not qualify. You sold your candle in a little glass dish as a candle and it should have been as a set, and therefore it has a different tariff requirement. For example, those kinds of things happen at the customs border. So maintaining this documentation is expensive. And while we set a threshold of, I think it's 1,000 euros, is it not, Sam, for the de minimis rule under CETA. This is what you can go cross-border shopping when you're on vacation. It's not commercially meaningful. And this level of threshold was set a long time ago and has not been significantly reformed. It should be. I argue that we should set this threshold in terms of the face value of duties payable, so that if you've got a low tariff, say like 1%, that you would allow 100,000 euros worth of imports coming in without the bother of all this documentation. There's no incentive to cheat. It would enable small business to enter into trade without having to first set up to deal with rules of origin and to take advantage of CETA. I worked with eBay on this, and eBay tells me that there is much greater use of e-commerce within Europe where there are no rules of origin than there is across borders when there are rules of origin in free trade zones. So we could substantially improve the impact of CETA on small business and on e-commerce by going to a more liberal rule for de minimis shipments, for small shipments, and we could do it in a way that would guard against the risk of cheating. So I think that's one area where CETA did not live up to sort of hopes of where we could go. And the other sort of issue I would flag is on ISDS. Now, the CETA mechanism is a substantial improvement on the procedural elements. It deals with all of the sort of dubious elements of lawyers working on both sides of the bench, and then therefore having an incentive to play games with their awards. But it doesn't deal with the substantive issues that ISDS was meant to deal with. Governments find themselves repeating time and again, that we retain the right to regulate. And at one point in my life, I spent 7 years developing legislation, and I would say, well, what does this mean? As a policy wonk, working within, what does this mean? And governments say, we have the right to regulate, and when people question, they say it even more forcefully. I have a story. I was once traveling in Greece, and I had a flat tire. And I asked a kid, where is the next garage? And he says to me, "Elasto finito." The tire's flat. I know, "Elasto finito." Where is the garage? And he says, "Elasto finito." I get it. But we were not communicating. And governments find themselves in the same position where they're saying, "Elasto finito," we retain the right to regulate, but it doesn't actually mean something to the parties. And that's why the criticism of ISDS, I think, has not abated. What ISDS needs is substantive guidelines for tribunals that explains why we put this in place, why we regulate in the first place, and why this is being litigated. And these guidelines, to give you a concrete example, supposing you're dealing with this nuclear case in Germany, right? So the reason why Germany went to shut down the nuclear reactor was because of the risk factor, the tail risk of a nuclear meltdown would be enormous costs. Okay? Now, a private company or even a state-owned company that's operating under commercial considerations ignores these tail risks. But a government can't. A company can go bankrupt and not face those tail risks. A government can't go bankrupt. It has to deal with that. So this tail risk, for example, is not factored into the commercial considerations of companies. So when you make an investment and this tail risk is identified and you want to say, we want to shut down this plant, we'll say, fine, you don't want to shut down? Then put up in escrow the cost, the potential risk cost to Germany of the meltdown. And I think that case would have gone away right there. And I think there are other kinds of substantive criteria that you can build into the ISDS mechanism that explains why we regulate in the first place, the substantive reasons, and that would deal with it. And I think CETA does well on the procedural side. It still does not have this substantive side. So there are ways to improve it, but I will conclude by saying that this is an important deal. It's a well-structured a deal in terms of the economics. It will not be disruptive in terms of sort of the kinds of fears that people have, the fear factor. It does not deal with the globalization. It's not the cause of these sort of things that have driven anti-globalization protests, but it does not deal with them either. It's not its intent. But there were, I think, still some room for improvement. But it's important, I think, for the world, for the global community right now, as an affirmation of an open, rules-based system, in particular for reducing uncertainty. So I'll stop there.